Hello. So today we're going to be taking a look at the pre-flight procedure. So what this procedure involves is checking almost every single switch and every single control in the cockpit to make sure that it's in the correct position in readiness for departure and in readiness to start the engines. Now, this procedure is quite complex because in real life, this procedure, or the actions and responsibilities which are parts of the pre-flight procedure, are normally shared between the captain and the first officer. Us, being single pilot flight simmers, don't have the luxury of having a co-pilot to double check things or to take away some of the workload, so this procedure is going to be quite lengthy, but we're going to get through it, and it'll be fine. The plane will be perfectly set up once we're done, don't worry about that. Now, one other thing that I'm going to say before I start this procedure is that I'm not really going to be explaining many of the systems in detail. If you want to understand what each system is, what each switch is and what it does, I've already covered that in the first 3 videos of this tutorial series, where I go through every single switch in the cockpit, every single panel, and explain what its purpose is, what it does, and how it can be used. In this procedure guide, all I'm simply going to be doing is just rattling through the panels and the switches fairly quickly. I'm going to try and avoid explaining how they work throughout this video. This is just going to be showing you what needs to be, which switches need to be in which position, and that's basically it. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the pre-flight procedures can be found in the FCOM 1 manual on pages 86 and 99. On those pages you'll find the first officer's pre-flight procedure, and then followed by the captain's pre-flight procedure. Now, as I said, because we're single pilot simmers, unless we're using an add-on, we have to do all of the actions ourselves, so I'm just going to rattle through that just now. This video is kind of an amalgamation of both the first officer's actions and the captain's actions, so I've kind of merged those two procedures together to provide you with a single pilot's procedure in effect. So let's get started. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be following a pilot's flow. So if you imagine dividing the overhead panel into 5 vertical columns like this, basically what we're going to do is start in the top left, work our way down, move across to the next column, work our way down, move across and down, move across and down, and then once we get to the bottom, we're going to work across the lighting panel from left to right. So first, we have the flight control panel up at the top left. We want to make sure that the flight control systems A and B, the guards, are closed. The low pressure lights should be on at this point. That's those lights are to be expected. Next, we want to check the spoiler systems A and B. Again, we want to make sure that these switches are guarded. Next, we go to the yaw damper at the bottom here. We want to make sure that that is switched on. We want to make sure that the yaw damper light goes off. Next, we want to check the standby hydraulic lights. So these are the lights up at the top here. We want to make sure that all of these lights are off. It's worth double checking the alternate flaps switch up here. Just make sure that's guarded. Finally, we want to make sure that these subsystem lights are all off just here. Next, we move down to the navigation panel. Very simply, we want to make sure that all of these switches are in the normal or auto position here. So we've got the navigation switches here, they're all in normal position, and then we've got the display switches here. One's in the auto position and the other is in the normal position. Down here on the fuel panel, we want to make sure that the engine and spar valve lights, these blue lights, are all on at this point. We want to make sure that these filter bypass lights either side are off. We want to make sure that the crossfeed selector is closed, so we want to make sure that the line here on the crossfeed selector is vertical and that this line is broken. We want to make sure that the crossfeed valve light is off. Further down, we want to make sure that the center fuel pump switches are off, and we want to make sure that the low pressure lights are off. And then finally, on the left and right side, we want to make sure that all of these fuel pump switches are off, and we want to make sure that we have low pressure lights for each of these switches. The low pressure lights are to be expected here. Next, moving up to the next panel here, is mainly electrical systems here. So first, we want to make sure that these electrical meter lights up at the top here are all off. Next, we want to check the battery master switch, make sure that that is guarded. Below that, we want to check, or sorry, next to that, we want to make sure that the cab utility and IFE and passenger systems are both on here. Moving down to the next panel, we want to make sure that the standby power switch is closed and guarded and that the standby power light is off. We also want to make sure that these generator drive switches are both closed and guarded, and that we have the generator drive lights. These lights being on is expected at the moment. Below that, we want to make sure that the bus transfer switch is closed and guarded. We want to make sure that the transfer bus off lights are both off. We want to make sure also that the source lights are off. These two blue gen off bus lights should be on at this point, so these lights are to be expected. Okay, moving down slightly, the next step, or the next action, is actually to turn on the APU. Now, if this is the first flight of the day, in real life, what pilots would do before the first flight of the day is conduct a fire test to make sure that all of the fire warning systems in the plane are working. If you want to see how to do that, I'm going to put in a little appendix at the end of this video, so if you want to see how to do the fire test, you can skip to the end of the video and see how to do that there. However, to keep the video going, I'm not going to do a fire test, so we're just going to go straight into starting up the APU. So before we start the APU, the first thing we can do is turn on the left forward fuel pump, like so. The APU does have its own fuel pump, however by turning on one of the wing fuel tank, one of the fuel tank pumps in one of the wings, what that does is that just reduces the amount of wear and tear on the APU's fuel pump. It's also used because the fuel pump in the wing here is also easier to kind of reach for maintenance purposes, rather than the APU. It's quite difficult to kind of get into the tail of the aircraft to replace a fuel pump in the APU. So that's why pilots may sometimes turn on the left forward fuel pump before starting the APU. After we do that, we can now turn on the APU itself. So we just come down to the APU master switch here, click it once to move it down into the on position, click it again to move it into start position. Now the APU will take a little while to start up, but what we can do is just keep an eye on the APU exhaust gas temperature gauge here. We'll get a little low oil pressure light, that's to be expected. A few seconds after that, the temperature should start to rise. Like so. So what the temperature will do is it should increase to maybe, I think, 700 degrees, maybe 700, 800 degrees. The low oil pressure light will go out, so that's to be expected. That's good, that's all normal. And then the temperature will start to slowly fall back down to about 400 or 300 degrees. Now, we know when the APU is ready. We can check to see when the APU is ready by two different means. First, we'll see that this APU gen off bus lights will come on. And we can also check the APU generator on the meter above, but I'll have a look at that in a few seconds. So there you see that the APU gen off bus light came on, so that's one way that we know that the APU is ready to be used. If we also have a look here on the AC selector, if we make sure we've got that selected to APU gen, we can see that we've got some values up here as well, which also show that the APU generator is online and ready to start supplying electrical power to the aircraft. Okay, so now the APU is up and running and we've got confirmation that the APU generator light is on. That means that the APU is now ready to supply electrical power to the aircraft. So we go to the APU generator switches here, to inner switches, click the left side on, click the right side on. We also want to make sure that the transfer bus lights and the source lights are off on both sides after switching onto APU power. So now, rather than using ground power, we are now using APU power to supply electrical power to the aircraft. Okay, moving up to the next column now, the central column. First, we want to make sure that these equipment cooling switches are both in the up normal position there, and that we have the off lights are actually off. Here, we want to make sure that the emergency exit lights are, or the switch here is guarded. We want to make sure that this not armed light goes out. So by guarding the switch, that automatically moves the switch into the armed position. Next, we can turn on the passenger seatbelt signs. So I like to turn them to on rather than auto for takeoff. I like to have the seatbelt signs explicitly on for takeoff. At the bottom here, just double check the windscreen wipers, just make sure they're both in the park position there. Moving up to the next column, now we can turn on the window heat switches. So that's these four switches up here, and we get the green on lights there, just confirming that the window heat is working for all four windows there. Next, we have the probe heat switches. We want to leave those off for the time being, and all of the lights being on for the probes there, that's normal, that's to be expected at this point. Next we move down to the wing and engine anti-ice systems. We want to make sure that all the switches here are off. Moving down to the hydraulic pump panel, we want to make sure that the engine hydraulic pumps are both on and that we have low pressure lights. So these are the outer switches here, are both in the on position and they have low pressure lights. The low pressure lights are to be expected. Also, if you have a look at the electric hydraulic pump switches, the two inside switches, we want to make sure that these switches are currently in the off position and that they also have low pressure lights. So that's all set up correctly there. Moving across to the right now, the first thing we want to check is the trim air switch. We want to make sure that's down in the on position there, so that's correct. Next we can check the zone temperature selectors, so we can select the temperature in each part of the aircraft as needed. Usually we just leave it on auto, that's fine as it is. Moving down, we want to make sure that the ram door full open lights, these two blue lights are currently on. We'll come back to the dual bleed light in a moment. Moving down, we want to make sure that the recirculation fans, both the left and right, are in the auto position. Next we can turn on the packs now, so we just move both pack switches down into the auto position, and you'll also hear that we start getting air conditioning now flowing through the inside of the aircraft. The next switch, the isolation valve, we want to make sure is down in the open position, which it is. At the bottom we want to make sure that the engine bleed switches and also the APU bleed switches are all in the on position, so they're all pushed down, which is correct. And with the APUs switch in the on position, we want to make sure that we do have that dual bleed light which is on, so that's correct there. And then finally we just want to check the pack warning lights here. We want to make sure all of these lights are off. Moving down once more now, we check the pressurization panel. First we want to make sure that all of these lights on the pressurization panel are off. Next we can set in our flight altitude. So this will be the cruising altitude for the flight. So we're going to be flying at flight level 360, which is around about 36,000 feet, just there. Next we can set in the landing altitude. So if you're not sure what the landing altitude is, this is the elevation of the airport that you're going to be landing at. I know from memory that Inverness is about 30 feet. So we're going to set the landing altitude to 50 feet. You'll notice that the landing altitude goes up in 50 feet increments, so just round it up or down to the nearest value, whichever airport you're flying to there. If you're not sure what the landing altitude is or the airport elevation that you're flying to, if you just do a Google search for an aviation chart for the airport that you're flying to, it will say on the aviation chart what the field elevation is. If you don't have the field elevation, then you can also use the runway elevation as the landing altitude as well. Okay, so once you've set in the altitudes there for the pressurization, you just want to double check this pressurization selector here and make sure that's in the auto position. Okay, finally at the bottom we have the lighting panel. So first on the left we want to make sure that all of the landing lights are currently switched off, so they're all in the up position there. We want to make sure that the runway turn-off lights are both off. We want to make sure that the taxi light is also off. We're going to skip the APU because we've already started that there. Next we have the engine start switches, so you want to make sure that these are either in the auto or off position there. Now depending on the aircraft that you're going to be flying, there may be one of two types of ignition system within the engines, so you want to make sure that the switches are either in the auto or off position. In the middle you want to have the ignition selector set to either left or right and never in both. I believe in real life that pilots will alternate which ignition system they use each flight. So if the first flight of the day had the ignition set to left, the next flight of the day would set to right, and then the third flight of the day would be back to left, so on and so forth. The reason that pilots do that is that it just wears down the igniters in the engines evenly over time. Moving over to the right we have some more light switches. So the logo lights, if it's dark outside and you want to promote the airline, you can turn the logo lights on. That just lights up the tail of the aircraft and obviously lights up the logo, surprisingly. The position light you want to make sure is down in the steady position. I already turned that on earlier as part of the electrical power on procedure, but if you forgot to do that or if you haven't done that, make sure that the position light is in the steady position. The anti-collision light needs to be off. And then again, the final two light switches here, the wing light and the wheel well light. If it's dark outside and you want to give ground crews a bit more light to work around the aircraft, then you can turn those on. However, during the daytime it's not necessary to have those lights on. Okay, so that's everything for the overhead panel. Now we're going to change our view and we're going to have a look at the glare shield. Okay, so here we are in the captain's seat, and we're just going to simply work from left to right along the glare shield. So this kind of panel, this long thin panel along the top of the forward displays here. So the first thing you can set, if you wish, would be the minimums. What some pilots may do, and this is something that's done in the PMDG tutorial flights, is what they do is they set the minimums to the acceleration height. The reason being is that this gives you just a little visual indicator here on the altitude tape as you're climbing away from the runway. Again, if you want to, you can do that. Personally, it's not something that I do. But that's just something that's covered in the PMDG tutorial flights, so if you want to do that, you can. Next, if you want to use the flight path vector, or if you need to view your altitude in meters, you can select those buttons as needed. Next, you can select the barometric pressure. So in the previous video, you should have been listening to an ATIS report, you should have got a weather report, just to kind of get the up-to-date local weather conditions. So at this point you can set the barometric pressure. So I'm just going to be using the fair weather preset for this flight, so I'm just going to set that to hectopascals, and I'm just going to leave it at 1013, which will be the standard pressure, which is what is used in the fair weather preset in FSX. Next, if you're going to be cross-checking your departure manually using VORs or ADFs, you can also turn on the VOR or ADF systems here on the EFIS control panel. Next, you want to make sure that the navigation display mode, the map mode, or so the mode is in the map mode position there. And then you also want to dial down the range to 10 nautical miles. That's probably the best range to see the initial departure there. If you're flying online or if you're flying with a traffic add-on, you can also use the traffic button there if needed. The weather radar needs to be off at this point, so you can turn the weather radar on and off using this button here. Here you can see the weather radar is on. We've got WXR there, we've got the kind of range lines there. However, before departure you want to make sure that the weather radar is actually switched off. Alternatively, all of these other map function buttons, you can switch those on as needed. Okay, moving across to the MCP panel in the center here, the first thing we need to do is turn on the flight director switches. So you want to make sure that you turn on the captain side first, if you're going to be flying from the captain's seat, that is, and then the first officers after that, and you want to make sure that we have the master on the correct side there. So if you're flying from the captain's seat, make sure that you turn on the left side flight director first. If you're going to be flying from the first officer's seat, make sure that you turn on the first officer's flight director first, and make sure that you have the green master indication there. Next, you want to select the bank angle selector. Usually if you're in busy airspace, it's best to have it on 30 degrees to allow the aircraft to turn more quickly. However, once you get up to the cruise phase of flights, you can set it down to 10 if you wish. And then the last thing to check is to make sure that the autopilot disengage bar is in the up position there. Okay, coming back over to the captain's seat now. The first thing that pilots, or the next thing that pilots would check in real life would be their oxygen systems. You can check it in the plane. You don't have to. Obviously, you're not going to die of asphyxiation flying a flight simulator. But it's a little feature there you can check if you wish. Next thing to check would be the clock. Just make sure that it does have the accurate local time there. Below that, you want to make sure that the nose wheel steering switch is guarded. So make sure that the guard is closed. Next, in the top middle here, you want to make sure that the display selectors are both in the normal position. Also, as a side note, you'll notice here that we've got the master caution light here. That's okay to have that light on at this point. It's only because we're still reconfiguring systems. We will clear all of the cautions, so you can cancel that master caution if you wish. It's not a big deal having that light on, during the pre-flight phase of phase of flight. Next we want to check these auto flight system disengage lights. So right click to push the light up, make sure you get 3 yellow lights. Left click to push the switch down, and you should have 2 red lights and 1 yellow light there. Next we're going to test the lights master switch. So to check all of the lights in the cockpit, what you want to do is just right click on that switch there. So what that light will do is that will move it up into, what that will do is move the switch into the test position, and that will light up every single indication in the cockpits. The reason being that what pilots would do at this point is just check every single indication to make sure that no light bulbs have failed, because obviously if you have a low fuel pressure warning come on and none of these low pressure lights come on, you can imagine the amount of confusion and difficulty in diagnosing a problem that would cause. So what pilots would do is just go through every single indication in the cockpit and just make sure that every single light is working. And basically they would follow the same type of flow that they worked through previously. So you'd start on the left hand side, work down the column, work down the next column, work down the next column, and then work from left to right across the forward panels, and then sort of from top to bottom, left to right through the center pedestal as well. Okay, so after checking the lights, the next thing to check would be some of the forward panels. So first we're going to check the primary flight display. We want to make sure that the flight mode annunciator columns here, so this kind of grey bar at the top, we want to make sure that all 3 columns are completely blank here. We also want to make sure that we have a green FD just above the artificial horizon there. The attitude indicator, that's the words I was looking for. Next we want to check the standby instruments. We want to make sure that these standby instruments match up what we have on our primary flight display. Usually if you're using the electric integrated instrument here, so this specific instrument, normally this will automatically kind of match up to what we have on the primary flight display here. Just going to change the barometric pressure there from inches to hectopascals. I just want to make sure that it's in the correct mode there. So we have an approach mode. We have a back course mode there as well. We just want to make sure it's in its kind of regular operating mode. Moving across to the center, first we want to make sure that the N1 reference is set to auto there. We also want to make sure that the speed reference selector is also in its auto position. Here, this fuel flow switch, what we want to do is just right click to reset the fuel flow there, and then that will give us a more accurate fuel usage reading during the flight there. The next switch we want to check is the auto brake selector. We want to move that now into the RTO, or rejected takeoff position. The auto brake disarm light should come on and then should disappear after a couple of seconds, which it has. Next we're going to check the upper and lower display unit. We just want to make sure that there's no abnormal readings. So for example, with the engine switched off, we want to make sure that there's no exhaust gas temperature. It'd be kind of concerning if the engines were switched off and we had high exhaust gas temperature, even though the engines have not been running. That would be an example of an abnormal reading. After we've checked all the displays, make sure that everything is normal and as expected. The next thing to check would be the landing gear lever. We just want to confirm again that that is in the down position, and then we have 3 green lights confirming that the landing gear is locked in the down position. And finally, for the forward panels, we just want to come over to the first officer side and just check this ground proximity warning system panel here. First, we want to make sure that the ground proximity warning system light is off, or this inoperative light is off. And we also want to make sure that the 3 switches here are guarded and the guards are closed. Okay, so after checking all of the forward panels, the next thing to check here will be the center pedestal. So first thing we're going to do is check all of these flight controls here. So first we're going to check the speed brake lever and make sure that's in the down position or fully forward. We also want to make sure that there's no speed brake lights on here. So we've got the speed brake lights on the captain's side. There's also one over on the first officer side. We just want to make sure that all of the speed brake related lights are all off. Next we want to make sure that the reverse thrust levers are in the down position. We also want to make sure that the forward thrust levers are in the kind of backwards or idle position just there. Next we want to check the flaps lever, and we want to make sure that the flaps lever matches the flaps indication here. So the flaps indicator is telling us that the flaps are up, and the flaps lever is in the up position as well. So that's all correct. Next we want to come to the controls on the front of the control stand here. So the parking brake is first. We want to turn the parking brake on now at this point. In the middle here we've got the engine start levers. We want to make sure those are both in the down cutoff position. And lastly we want to check the stabilizer trim switches and make sure that the cutout switches are in the normal position and that they have their little metal guards preventing them from being pushed down accidentally. Okay, and finally we have the radio stacks on the radio panels here. So the first thing you want to do is set up your communication radios. So some of the frequencies that you might want to make a note of will be the clearance delivery if the airport has one. Usually you'll find that at major airports. You want to have your ground frequency ready for taxiing. You want to have the tower frequency ready for takeoff, sort of takeoff instructions, permission and things like that. You also want to have a departure frequency to hand as well and ready to use. So those are some of the frequencies that you would need kind of at this early stage of the flights. Next, if you're going to be cross-checking your departure procedures, you want to set up your navigation radios. Now, something I kind of gleaned from PMDG's tutorial missions, normally what PMDG recommends in their tutorials is to set up the active frequency on both sides for a couple of nav aids that you're going to be using during the flights. It's not something I'm going to be doing during these initial procedure guide videos, but I will be doing another future flights where I'll do some more advanced things, where I'll look at cross-checking your departure procedure with manual navigation. But what PMDG recommends is to set up your active frequencies for nav aids along the departure procedure, so you can cross-check to make sure that you are turning at the correct time and that you are flying towards the correct nav aids, for example. What they also recommend is on your standby frequencies is to set up the ILS in case you need to make an immediate return to the airport that you're departing from. They recommend setting up the ILS frequency into the standby frequency on both radios as well. Again, that's just a kind of a precautionary measure if you need to return back to the airport you're departing from for any reason. If you are going to be cross-checking your departure procedure, you'll also need to go back up to the Mcp panel and just adjust the course selectors there. That will draw those green dotted lines onto your nav display, so as I said, just so you can cross-check your departure procedure there. Next, you want to set up your audio control panel as needed. Usually you won't need to do this. Normally I find myself using this panel just to tune into the various nav aids, just to listen to the Morse code identifiers, just to make sure that they're all working okay. But usually I find that I don't need to manually change the microphone for any system at all. And then finally, if you need to use ADFs for any reason, you can use the ADF radio here. The next thing to check will be the cargo fire panel. So much like the main fire test, I'm going to do a little appendix at the end of this video. So if you want to see how to test the cargo fire systems, you can check out that little kind of appendix at the end of this video. After that, you can check the weather radar. So if you want to manually adjust the weather radar settings for any reason, maybe if you want to turn up the gain to make the weather radar a bit more sensitive, you can do that there. And also, if the aircraft has one equipped, you can also set up the Hud system. Much like setting up the navigation standby frequencies, it's recommended at this stage of the flight to set up for a precautionary return to your departure airport. So if you know how to, you would enter in information relating to the runway that you expect to land on if you need to make an immediate return. As I've said in previous videos, I will be covering the HUD in its own video at a later date, so I'm not going to cover that here. That will be covered in its own video at a later date. Okay, so once you've worked down this first column and made your way down to the HUD system, if there is one, now would be a good time to contact air traffic control. So at this point, you would be contacting air traffic control clearance delivery or departure clearance, or delivery clearance, something along those lines, to obtain your IFR clearance for departure. Now, the reason I suggest contacting ATC now is because as part of your departure clearance, you'll be issued a squawk code. And if we have a look down here, the next panel we have here, conveniently, is our Transponder Panel. So air traffic control will give you a squawk code as part of your clearance, or your IFR clearance. So once you've got that from air traffic control, now would be the perfect time to enter in your kind of departure clearance there. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to be flying with like an online service at all, but we'll just tune in something a little bit appropriate there. So we'll enter in our transponder code there, and we'll also leave the transponder on standby mode at this point. Okay, and the last thing to check will be the stabilizer trim override switch. So if we have a look at the back of the center pedestal here, it's this switch here. You just want to make sure that's down and in the guarded position there. Okay, so now that we've checked all of that, now we can move on to the first checklist of the 737 that we're going to be taking a look at, and that's going to be the pre-flight checklist. So you can find the pre-flight checklist in the QRH PDF document that comes with the aircraft. If you have a look on page 25, you'll find the pre-flight checklist. So a lot of people mistake checklists in commercial jets for being procedure guides. Now, certainly in small aircraft like a Cessna, you can use a checklist to go through each essential item in the list. However, commercial jets, being more complex aircraft, you need to go through the procedures, which are essentially memory items. So pilots will actually memorize all of these switch positions and all of these actions and what order they need to go in. And then they use a checklist to just double check the essential things. A checklist is not a procedure guide. A checklist is just a confirmation that you've done the essential actions. So, going through the pre-flight checklist here. So first we take a look at the oxygen systems. So those would be the oxygen masks on both sides. Pilots would confirm with each other that they've both tested their oxygen systems. The next item to check will be the navigation and display switches. So that's over here on the left hand side. You want to make sure that all of these navigation and display switches are in the auto or normal position here. Next would be to check the window heat, so you just confirm that the window heat switches are all on, and we have 4 green lights there for the window heat. The final thing to check on the overhead panel is the pressurization mode selector. That's this switch here. You just want to confirm that's in the auto position. Moving back to the forward panels, the next thing to check would be the flight instruments. So pilots would just double check on both sides. They would just check the heading and altimeter settings, just make sure that both sides, or both flight displays on both sides of the cockpit both match up and are both giving the same indications to both pilots. Next thing to check will be the parking brake. Just confirm that that is on. And then finally, just double check the engine start levers, make sure they're both in the cut-off position there, and that's the checklist completed. And with that, that is the pre-flight procedure finished. Now, I know there's quite a lot to take in there, but once you've started running through it a few times, you'll start to remember which switches need to be actually moved and which switches are already in the correct position there. As I said, in real life, this is something that pilots would memorize, and it's something that they can rattle through in a matter of minutes. Because this is obviously a tutorial, this takes a bit longer, but once you've run through it a few times, you'll actually start to memorize the procedure, memorize the kind of the flows and kind of the way that you move your attention around the cockpit or the flight deck, and you'll actually start to memorize which switches go where, and this whole process will become much quicker for you in the future. So that's the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at starting the engines, which is actually going to encompass several procedures. There's actually a before start procedure, there's the actual engine start procedure, and then there's an after start procedure. So we're going to be looking at a couple of different procedures in that next video, and also a couple more checklists and things like that. If you want to stick around and watch the appendices for this video, it's going to be both the main fire test and also the cargo fire test at the end of this video. So those are coming up if you want to watch those. But essentially that's it for the main part of the video. So for now, thank you all very much for watching. Take care out there, and I will catch you all later. Okay, and welcome to this appendix where we're going to be taking a look at the overheat and fire protection test. So we're just going to rattle through this step by step very quickly, and yeah, I'm just going to demonstrate how to perform a fire test using the main fire test panel up here. So first we want to make sure that the overheat detector switches are both in the central normal position here. Next we want to move this test switch to the left side, to the fault and in-up side. Now the problem is, if I click on my mouse and then let go, the switch automatically jumps back to the center. So how can I prevent that from happening? Well, if you left click to hold the switch to the left side, hold down your mouse button and then move your mouse off the switch and then release the mouse button. If you listen, I've moved my mouse away, but the switch is in the same place. So that's a little trick that you can use to check different things within the aircraft. Just click and hold the switch into the correct position, then move your mouse off the switch to keep the switch in that position there. So with the test switch moved to the fault in-up side, there's a couple of things that we want to check. First, we want to make sure that this fault light comes on. Next, we want to make sure that this APU detection in-up light comes on. And then also on the glare shield, if we have a look up here, we also want to make sure that the master caution light comes on, and also that we get an overheat detected annunciator warning here as well. So that's all working okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to left click the switch again, just to move it back into the center. Now next we're going to move the switch over to the right side, to the overheat and fire side. Now what I've done is I've just turned the in-game sound down because the alarm bell is going to start sounding, and I don't want it to be too loud, just so I can explain what to look for over the sound of the alarm here. So we're going to move the switch to the right and hold the switch in that position as before. Okay, so the first thing you want to make sure is that the fire warning bell is actually ringing. You can actually hear it. Next, you want to make sure that these red fire handle switches all light up. So 1, APU and 2 are all lit up. You want to make sure that the wheel well light is on. You also want to make sure that engine overheat 1 and engine 2 overheat are both on there. Up on the glare shield, you want to make sure that the fire warning light is on. You want to make sure that the master caution light is on, and also that we get the overheat detected annunciator again. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to press one of the fire warning buttons here, and we want to make sure that that does actually cancel the bell and that the light goes out. And then what we want to do is have a look down here again and make sure that even after we've cancelled the bell, that the lights all stay on down here on the fire panel. So once we're happy that everything is okay there, we can move the switch back to its central position. Now there's one extra little thing that we can check down here, and that's the extinguisher system. So again, very simply, just move the switch to the left to make sure we get 3 green lights there, and then to the right, again make sure we get 3 green lights there. So that's all okay, that's all correct. And that's how you perform the basic overheat and fire protection test. And welcome to this second appendix where we're going to perform a cargo fire test using this smaller panel down here. So much like the main fire test, we're just going to do or press a test button. We're going to hear the fire warning bell, or we should hear the fire warning bell, that's why we're testing it, and we should get a few lights and indications up here. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that the detector switches are both in their central normal position there. Next I'm going to press the test switch, and then after a second or two we should hear the fire warning bell. So we want to make sure that 1, we get the fire warning bell, and 2, we also get the master fire warning lights come on. So we're going to press this button, and we want to make sure that the bell does cancel and that the light does go out. However, we want to have a look down at the cargo panel again and make sure that the following lights stay on. So first we want to make sure that the extinguisher lights stay on here, the 2 green lights, so that's okay. We want to make sure that the forward and aft lights stay on, which they do, and we also want to make sure that this discharge light stays on here. Now, this detector fault light should stay off at all times during the test, so that light being off is okay, that's expected. And very simply, that's it for the cargo fire test.